core of what this rolling thunder thing is all about. And I don't have a clue, because it's about nothing. It's just something that happened 40 years ago.
Bob Dylan wasn't just a musician. He was a force of nature, a rebel poet whose songs lit the fire under a generation desperate for change. His lyrics shattered silence. His voice pierced through walls built by fear. And by the mid-1960s, Dylan had become something far bigger than an artist. He was a living symbol of revolution. Legends bowed before him. Icons hailed him. But curiously, not everyone wanted to stand beside him. Some of the biggest names in rock, including the Rolling Stones' electrifying frontman Mick Jagger, quietly turned away when the chance to collaborate arose. Why would they refuse the one man who redefined music itself? Was it intimidation? A fear of being eclipsed? Or was there something even darker at play? The truth isn't just surprising. It rewrites the story of rock history, and it all begins with the collision of two unstoppable forces. By the time the summer of 1965 scorched its way across America, Bob Dylan was no longer just a scrappy folk singer from Minnesota. He was the pulse of a restless generation, the poet who could capture an entire movement's fury and hope in a handful of words. Blowin' in the Wind wasn't just a song, it was a battle cry. The times they are a-changin' wasn't just a melody, it was a prophecy. His guitar, his gravelly voice, his cryptic mind, they didn't merely reflect the world's chaos. They shaped it. Musicians worshipped him, fans idolized him, politicians feared him. And yet, in the heart of the rock world, something peculiar stirred. The louder Dylan's influence roared, the quieter certain rock icons became when it came to working with him. One of the most glaring of these silences came from Mick Jagger himself, a man whose very soul thrived on pushing boundaries. Jagger admired Dylan. There's no denying that. He respected the words, the energy, the mystique. But admiration does not always lead to partnership. As Dylan's star blazed hotter, it cast long, cold shadows over those who dared approach. For rockers like Jagger, Dylan wasn't merely a collaborator. He was a black hole, threatening to pull even the brightest lights into his unpredictable orbit. Was it fear? Was it ego? Or was it a survival instinct that warned them? Stay in your own lane, or risk being consumed. Mick Jagger's eventual revelations would pull back the curtain on a tension that had simmered in the shadows for decades. And it wasn't just about pride. It was about the very nature of chaos and control, identity and survival. But to truly understand why Jagger, and so many of his peers hesitated to step into Bob Dylan's volatile world, we first have to look deeper. We have to understand the man behind the myth. Because Bob Dylan wasn't just a force of change. He was a storm no one could predict. Tours survive unchanged, and once you see how Dylan built his legend, you'll understand why even the bravest refused to join him. Before the world called him a legend, before history sealed his name in gold, Bob Dylan was just Robert Zimmerman, a quiet boy from the small town of Duluth, Minnesota. Lost in the crackling sounds of late-night radio, the blues of Muddy Waters, the aching country ballads of Hank Williams, the raw sorrow of Lead Belly, they weren't just songs to young Robert. They were lifelines. Each note stitched itself into his restless soul, whispering of a world far beyond the gray borders of his hometown. He wasn't born into greatness. He clawed his way toward it, one scribbled lyric at a time. By 1961, Robert Zimmerman had shed his skin. New York City's Greenwich Village, wild, chaotic, pulsing with the energy of folk protests and beat poetry, became his battleground. He arrived with little more than a guitar and an unshakable hunger, but it didn't take long for the village to notice. He wasn't just another kid strumming chords on a street corner. There was a fire in him that burned differently. His songs carried the bruises of a nation and the hope of something bigger. Within months, Bob Dylan was no longer a face in the crowd. He was the face. Then came the flood. Blowin' in the Wind didn't just land, it detonated. The times they are a-changin' rolled like thunder across a fractured America. A chilling promise to those clinging desperately to the old ways. Dylan's words stitched themselves into protest marches, civil rights rallies, and tear-streaked living rooms. He wasn't following the times. He was dragging them forward, kicking and screaming. Every note he played, every line he penned, rewrote the rules of what music could dare to say. Musicians who had spent years honing their craft looked up and realized they were standing in the long shadow of a new kind of songwriter. They didn't just admire Dylan. They revered him. Rockers, folk singers, pop stars, they all knew they were witnessing something irreversible. A raw genius who defied structure, logic, even expectation itself. But admiration, no matter how pure, carries its own kind of danger. The higher Dylan climbed, the more treacherous the ground beneath him became. Artists who once dreamed of sharing a stage with him began to hesitate. Some whispered that working with Dylan was like chasing a ghost through a burning forest. You could lose yourself before you ever caught him. Because behind the brilliance lurked something far more unpredictable. As Dylan's star rose higher into the sky, so did the warning signs. Signs that collaborating with him wasn't just about making music. It was about surrendering to a storm you couldn't control. A storm that didn't care who it consumed. And as the admiration grew into something almost fearful, a question began to form in the minds of rock's biggest icons. Could anyone truly survive working alongside Bob Dylan? Or would they simply disappear into his chaos? As Dylan's fame grew into something monstrous and magnificent, the seeds of hesitation were already being planted deep inside the rock world's brightest stars. And it would only get harder from here, because stepping into Dylan's orbit wasn't a collaboration. It was a collision. And for those like Mick Jagger, survival sometimes meant keeping your distance. In Bob Dylan's world, structure was an illusion, and stability was a lie. Collaboration wasn't a partnership. It was a blindfolded leap into the unknown. Where other musicians built their art carefully, brick by brick, Dylan tore down walls before anyone even knew they existed. To work with him was to surrender logic, to abandon planning, to embrace a whirlwind that refused to be tamed. The warning signs were there for anyone brave enough to look. In 1965, Dylan shattered expectations at the Newport Folk Festival in a way that still echoes through music history. Fans who came to hear their poetic hero strum acoustic ballads were instead blasted by the furious roar of electric guitars. Without a word of preparation, without a sliver of warning, Dylan plugged in, cranked up the volume, and unleashed a sound that split the folk world in two. Some called it betrayal. Others called it genius. But everyone knew one thing for certain: Dylan would not be confined. Not by tradition, not by loyalty, not by anyone. In the studio, things were no less volatile. Stories from Dylan's recording sessions read like fever dreams. Musicians summoned to capture his vision found themselves clutching half-finished lyrics, deciphering vague, maddening instructions like, "Play it like it's raining," or "Make it sound like broken glass." There were no clean takes, no rehearsed bridges. Dylan moved like a storm across the studio floor, changing verses mid-song, discarding melodies without regret. Those who couldn't keep up were simply left behind. Those who could were pulled into moments of brilliance that seemed almost accidental, and sometimes almost cruel. It was during the chaotic sessions for Highway 61 Revisited that Dylan's method, if it could even be called that, reached new levels of madness. Musicians like Al Kooper and Mike Bloomfield were dragged into a creative freefall where the ground shifted beneath them every second. Dylan barked out fragments of ideas, mumbled half-formed directions, and demanded spontaneity at a breakneck pace. And yet, somehow, out of that chaos came Like a Rolling Stone. A song so powerful, it didn't just redefine Dylan. It redefined what rock and roll could be. But for organized rockers like Mick Jagger, Dylan's way of working wasn't exhilarating. It was terrifying. The Rolling Stones had built their empire on precision, on chemistry, on a near-telepathic connection between Jagger's snarling vocals and Keith Richards' razor-sharp riffs. To step into Dylan's world was to risk losing that delicate balance. It wasn't just collaboration they feared. It was disintegration. Because in Dylan's world, you didn't control the music. The music controlled you, and it didn't care who you were. And that fear wasn't just theoretical. It was real. It was written on the faces of seasoned musicians who stumbled out of Dylan's sessions looking dazed, exhausted, and sometimes defeated. Working with him meant surrendering your identity at the door. For Jagger and his peers, the price of that surrender was simply too high. Yet Dylan's unpredictable temperament wasn't the only reason the rock world hesitated. There was something even more unsettling hiding just beneath the chaos. Something that no amount of talent, fame, or respect could protect them from. And it was a threat that grew larger with every step Dylan took toward becoming not just a man, but a myth. Standing next to Bob Dylan wasn't just a collaboration, it was surrender. It was stepping into a shadow so vast, so consuming, that even the brightest stars risked being swallowed whole. After his near-fatal motorcycle accident in 1966, Dylan didn't just retreat from the public eye, he transcended it. He stopped being a man and became something more dangerous. A myth. Every whisper about him, every half-glimpsed move he made, fed into a growing legend that no one could match, and even fewer dared to challenge. His every step was studied like scripture, his every silence analyzed like prophecy. The world didn't just listen to Bob Dylan, they interpreted him. What he wore, where he went, who he spoke to, nothing was casual anymore. It was as if Dylan had crossed some invisible threshold where normal rules no longer applied. To align yourself with him was to willingly become a background figure in someone else's gospel. Mick Jagger understood this better than most. He had clawed his way to the top through pure force of will, transforming himself from an awkward English kid into one of rock's most magnetic forces. Jagger wasn't just a singer. He was a phenomenon, a symbol of swagger and rebellion. But even he knew deep down that standing shoulder to shoulder with Dylan risked turning him into little more than a footnote. In rare moments of brutal honesty, Jagger admitted the unspoken truth. They all loved Bob, but none of them wanted to be overshadowed by him because Dylan didn't dominate intentionally. He didn't walk into a room demanding the spotlight. He simply was the spotlight. His mere presence shifted the air, commanding attention, dragging everything around him into his gravitational pull. Even in casual jam sessions, even when he wasn't trying, Dylan made the music about him. Not out of ego, but because the myth had grown too large to ignore. Sharing the stage with him wasn't an equal partnership. It was submission to a force you couldn't match, no matter how great you were. For rockers like Jagger, whose entire identities were built on carving out their own mythologies, that was a line they couldn't afford to cross. Respect wasn't the issue. Talent wasn't the issue. It was survival, artistic survival, personal survival. Because once you let Dylan's myth swallow you, there was no coming back. And when those rare encounters between Dylan and the rock elite actually happened, they didn't ease these fears. They only confirmed the nightmare that collaboration with Dylan wasn't just risky, it was impossible. Because in the world of gods and titans, even admiration can turn deadly when legacies are on the line. One night in New York could have changed everything, but it didn't. It was 1972, and the city pulsed with the aftershocks of a Rolling Stones tour that had set America ablaze. The band was on top of the world, drunk on their own momentum, basking in the glow of a rebellious dynasty they had carved from grit and swagger. And then, without warning, Bob Dylan walked through the door. Word traveled fast. Dylan, the elusive enigma, was here, guitar in hand, ready to play. It should have been a coronation, a moment when two titans merged and history snapped in half. But what followed was not triumph. It was paralysis. Jagger would later describe it with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Dylan strummed a few chords, mumbled a melody, and suddenly the room froze. The rhythm was slippery, the lyrics half-formed riddles drifting through the smoke. Every rocker in that room, men who had conquered stadiums and outlasted scandals, sat rooted to the spot, too stunned to move. Nobody knew where Dylan was going. Nobody dared jump in. Half the room thought they were witnessing brilliance. The other half thought they were losing their minds. Jagger, feeling the pulse of the moment slipping further into chaos, made a quiet decision. He didn't play. He didn't sing. He watched, because deep down, he understood there was no way to catch Dylan when he was already miles ahead and 6 worlds away. Years later, another chance flickered into existence, this time under the blinding global spotlight of Live Aid in 1985. The stakes were even higher. The world was watching. Dylan agreed to perform, flanked by none other than Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood. For a brief moment, the universe seemed ready to deliver the collaboration fans had always dreamed of. But dreams have a way of turning sour under pressure. Dylan's performance was loose, ragged, almost incoherent. He changed keys without warning. He skipped verses. Richards and Wood stumbled behind him, struggling to keep pace with a man who refused to be tied down, even on the biggest stage on Earth. Jagger was there too, standing backstage, his instincts once again sharpening. He watched as Dylan unraveled a set that should have been immortal and turned it into a cautionary tale. And once again, Jagger made his move not toward Dylan, but away from him. He chose order over chaos, structure over spontaneity. He took the stage later, not with Dylan, but with Tina Turner, delivering a performance built on discipline, electricity, and absolute control. It was not fear that held him back. It was survival. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The Stones thrived on rhythm, on precision, on a certain magic that demanded balance. Dylan thrived on obliterating every expectation, every beat, every plan. Their worlds didn't just clash. They repelled each other, like two magnets flipped the wrong way. Yet even beyond the jam sessions and the missed chances, it became clear that something much deeper separated them, a fundamental, unbridgeable rift between two forces destined to run parallel, but never truly collide. It wasn't just music, it was brand survival. The Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan weren't simply entertainers. They were empires, forged through blood, rebellion, and the raw hunger to stand apart from everything that came before. And when two empires collide, it's not harmony that follows. It's war, silent but brutal. The Stones had built their kingdom on a carefully balanced image, dangerous, defiant, but meticulously controlled. They played the villains to the Beatles' sweethearts, weaving a myth of leather-clad anarchy that thrilled and terrified in equal measure. Every strut, every sneer, every guitar riff was sharpened to maintain that fragile, seductive chaos. Dylan, meanwhile, was an entirely different storm. He wasn't selling rebellion. He was embodying something far more slippery, far more disquieting. His brand was mystery, philosophy, a living cipher who could never be cornered or labeled. Dylan didn't just sing songs he dropped riddles into, a world desperate for answers, then walked away before anyone could ask him to explain. His power was in his elusiveness. His strength was in never standing still long enough to be caught. When Dylan, later in the 1980s, quietly formed the Traveling Wilburys, a loose, brilliant supergroup with George Harrison, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne, the invitation to join was not flung open to just anyone. Legends were gathering, boundaries dissolving. But when whispers reached Jagger's camp, the answer was clear and decisive. He declined. Politely, respectfully, but firmly. Jagger didn't hesitate to explain why, later on. "Bob's got his crew. I've got mine," he said, with a shrug that hid more than it revealed. Because deep down, it was never about liking Dylan or respecting him. That was a given. It was about survival protecting the sanctity of the Stones' mythology. Mixing with Dylan's world, with its shifting moods and enigmatic detours, would have shattered the carefully crafted identity the Stones had fought to protect. Jagger wasn't afraid of Dylan's talent. He was wary of the erosion that could follow a collision. In the world they ruled, perception was everything. Image wasn't a side effect, it was the product. And while mutual respect endured, etched into occasional nods, backstage greetings, and quiet acknowledgments, there was an unspoken understanding that their paths, however close they came to crossing, were never meant to merge. They could admire each other across the canyon. But neither was willing to risk everything they had built to stand in the other's world. As the years rolled on, that distance didn't shrink. If anything, it stretched wider, crystallizing into something undeniable. Because while time evolved everything else, the core reasons why Jagger and Dylan remained separate never changed. they only grew stronger. Two men, two worlds, still thriving, still standing, against all odds, against the slow erosion of time that has swallowed countless others. Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan remain monuments in a landscape they once helped carve. Legends not frozen in their glory, but still moving, still reshaping the world beneath their feet in ways few ever imagined possible. In 2024, the Rolling Stones thundered back into the spotlight with a force that defied reason. Hackney Diamonds, their first album of original material in nearly 2 decades, exploded onto the charts, proving that Jagger's fire hadn't dimmed, it had only grown hungrier. The tour that followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos, a celebration of rebellion wrapped in a spectacle of lights, sound, and undiminished swagger. Critics marveled at Jagger's stamina, his voice slicing through arenas with a sharpness men half his age would envy. Rumors swirled of a solo EP in the works, whispers that the restless king of rock wasn't ready to hand over his crown just yet. And then there was Dylan, the eternal wanderer, the restless ghost. His never-ending tour, a journey that began in 1988, showed no signs of slowing. In fact, Dylan's presence had grown heavier, his voice a weathered growl etched with experience, his performances stripped to the bone. His 2020 album, Rough and Rowdy Ways, had stunned even his harshest critics. Its sprawling, shadowed tracks cementing Dylan's place not just as a relic, but as a living, breathing force of artistry. His tour dates for 2025 stretched across continents, a testament to a man who refused to become a statue for worship. But the road hadn't been without battle scars. In 2019, Jagger faced down the specter of mortality with heart surgery that could have ended everything. Instead, he emerged fiercer, leaner, a man who refused to let the clock dictate his rhythm. Dylan, too, had wrestled his demons. A brutal bout of pneumonia in 2024 forced him to reschedule shows. But true to form, he returned with a simple, defiant message. "I'll be there." Their bodies bore the weight of time, but their spirits remained unbroken. The differences between them were never clearer. The Stones roared through giant stadiums, each show a polished, explosive display of grandeur. Dylan stood under dim lights, with a small band, weaving sparse, haunting tales, with no pyrotechnics, no grand speeches, only the raw pulse of truth. Two kings ruling separate empires, each defining success on their own, unwavering terms. In 2023, fate briefly pulled them into the same orbit once again. Backstage at a benefit concert in New York, Jagger and Dylan shared a moment, no performance, no fanfare, just a conversation carved in quiet respect. Jagger praised Dylan's latest record. Dylan nodded at the Stones' relentless staying power. No jam session followed, no forced duet. Just two warriors acknowledging that their battles had taken them down different roads. But the war, the drive to create, to defy, to endure, remained the same. And now, as they stride deeper into the twilight of their careers, one question haunts the horizon like a final, unplayed note. Did their decision to stay apart, ultimately, cost them something profound, or was it the very choice that preserved their greatness? Because sometimes, history isn't shaped by the alliances that form. Sometimes, it's shaped by the ones that never did. Separate paths, separate legacies, shared immortality. Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan didn't need to merge their talents to leave a scar on history. They didn't need a joint anthem or a historic album to validate their genius. Their greatness wasn't forged by collaboration. It was carved out in solitude, fueled by ambition, hardened by the refusal to compromise who they were. Mick Jagger went on to sculpt the very shape of modern rock's swagger. His fingerprints are everywhere, from the sharp defiance of the Killers to the brooding arrogance of Arctic Monkeys. His influence isn't a relic locked in the past. It's alive. It's loud. Every new generation that picks up a guitar and sneers into a microphone is echoing a move Jagger first made decades ago. Bob Dylan, in contrast, redefined the soul of songwriting. He gave the world permission to think deeper, to question louder, to hurt in verses that didn't need polish to feel profound. His legacy echoes through the poetic ache of artists like Phoebe Bridgers and Father John Misty, musicians who bleed their truths without apology because Dylan taught them that imperfection could be transcendent. Even in the digital age, their impact remains untouched. Jagger's social media buzzes with the energy of a showman who still knows how to work a crowd, teasing tours and projects with the wink of a master. Dylan's online presence, sparse and cryptic, sparks a frenzy with a single line, a whispered lyric, a sudden date announcement. Two different approaches, two enduring empires. In the end, their decision not to collaborate didn't dilute their magic, it amplified it. They remained pure, unblended forces. Each man stood firmly in his own arena, refusing to share a spotlight they had built with their own hands. And maybe that stubbornness, that fierce independence, is exactly why their names will continue to echo long after stages go dark. So now, the question falls to you. Would a partnership between Dylan and Jagger have been a blessing or a curse? Would it have created a moment for the ages, or shattered two myths that were always meant to stand apart? Legends don't always need to join forces to shape history. Sometimes, the power lies in knowing when to walk alone. Now, tell us which side are you on? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.